1. Good day, and welcome to the 9th SCGES webinar. My name is Carol Woodward, and I'm a researcher at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in the United States. I'm also the Vice Chair of the Standing Committee for Gender Equality in Science, the SCGES. SCGES is an independent committee formed in 2020 by 9 international scientific organizations, most of which are full members of the International Science Council. These founding partners had worked together on the ISC supported project, a global approach to the gender gap in mathematical computing and natural sciences, how to measure it and how to reduce it, which became known as the Gender Gap in Science Project. Today, SCGES has 22 partners, most of which are ISC International Union members. They represent millions of scientists brought together across disciplines to promote gender equality in science. The aim of SCGES is to ensure liaison amongst international science unions to foster gender equality and the implementation of recommendations of the Gender Gap in Science Project, especially in the scientific communities that the scientific unions represent. SCGES has also issued recommendations to safeguard gender equality in science in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. SCGES actively cooperates with policymakers and international organizations, first and foremost ISC, for the promotion of gender equality in science. Our webinars are usually organized by 1 or 2 of our partner unions, and today's webinar is organized by the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research and will address issues of gender and other diversity considerations within the polar sciences. But before introducing our speakers today, and moving over to our session host, let me say a few words about all of you, the audience. According to the count made on Monday, the 109 persons who had registered to attend the present webinar live on 6 continents, although 1/3 of them is in Europe. Asia, North and South America, Australia, and Africa are also represented as well. As we found at previous webinars, just under 75% of the registered audience is composed of women. About 13% are men, and about 13% are preferring not to state their gender. And we also note that regarding disciplines, it's good to see that the audience is quite multidisciplinary, with geography, mathematics, and polar science being the most represented today. And last but not least, all career stages are represented among you, which confirms that gender equality is of interest and of importance at all career stages. So now I'll turn this over to SCAR and Jolda Kakavo, who will chair our session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. My name is Jolda Kakavo, and I'm the Deputy Chief Officer of the SCAR Action Group on Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. To start, I just want to run through a brief code of conduct. So this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to the SCGES YouTube page, and will also be shared on the SCAR and other websites and social media to view afterwards. And the full program as well is available today on the SCGES website and the SCAR website. Any questions that you might have today, be sure to type those directly into the YouTube comments box. And these questions will then be addressed in the panel discussion at the end of the talks. What's most important for today is that we want to create a respectful atmosphere and listen and ask questions with an open mind. Any abuse or harassment of any kind will not be tolerated. And so I would be happy to now introduce our first speaker, who is Pilvi Muschiatello, who is part of the SCAR Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Group, as well as DIPSI and the British Antarctic Survey. Pilvi is an impact facilitator at the British Antarctic Survey and holds the position of secretary in the SCAR group, as well as being involved in the DIPSI initiative. And due to her different roles, she has had a broad experience in dealing with EDI-related topics. So I'm very happy to hand over the floor to Pilvi today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jilda, for that excellent introduction. You have shaved off a few things that I need to say then as I get started. So So I've been invited today to give a little bit of like the broader context to the work on EDI within and around the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. In addition to the introduction that Gilda has already given, I would like to add that in terms of societal constructs of gender, I identify personally beyond the binary. So my preferred pronouns are they, them. And I've been working the last couple of years really intensely with EDI, most recently within SCAR and the more like global context, but especially within the context of the UK in my role within the British Antarctic Survey. I'm going to give a little bit of a general overview to start with, to try and put Antarctic research into its historical context, then talk a little bit about SCAR as an organization and how our EDI work has evolved. And then I'm going to reflect on a few things that we have been working on. And mostly I would like to say that I'm going to give some kind of like personal reflections based on the conversations and interactions that we've been having with colleagues within the organization. So hopefully that gives some food for thought also for the conversations later. And in some of my slides, I'm throwing in some questions that I'd like to kind of see reflected maybe in the panel, but hopefully you'll all have so many good questions that they might not even get to mine. So with that, hopefully I'll get to share. All right, so we're going to start with just a kind of very general mind exercise. If I throw the phrase at you, heroic age of Antarctic exploration, and ask you to kind of picture what an Antarctic explorer in the heroic age might look like, I'd like to just kind of try to get you to imagine who you would picture. And hopefully you don't need too long for that mental image. What I'm trying to get at is that probably I would dare say that quite a few of you will be picturing white bearded men, black and white photos potentially, and in this like very arid white landscape. And I'm going to save you from showing that kind of imagery because I think it's very strong in our minds, but just say that there's a lot of research that kind of highlights very strongly where the historical context for Antarctic research has come from. Its roots that are in some ways quite colonial, and the fact that there is like Antarctic science is often associated with these sort of really strong masculine figures, like you can see in this quote, battling against the blizzard, you know, like hardy, able-bodied, fit men. And the pervasiveness of this heroic white masculine image of leadership and kind of like the stereotype of what that explorer looks like is still extremely strong in our minds and in society broadly in general. And we know that in Antarctic research and in other STEM research cultures, these sort of stereotypes have affected different opportunities given to people of other genders historically. In the case of Antarctic science, very like more specifically in the last few decades, the increase of women has been extremely noticeable, but it has to be said that, for example, for a nation like the UK, it wasn't until the mid-1990s that women were allowed to winter and fully start participating in Antarctic fieldwork opportunities, for example. And this is just picking out one part of our identity. If we look at kind of our identities in a much more intersectional, through a much more intersectional lens, then those barriers are ever increasing. And I'll talk a lot more about like intersectionality, hopefully throughout this talk as well. So I want to then start thinking about the new age of Antarctic exploration. Like, how can we reimagine this stereotype of Antarctic explorers. And I'd like to say that I don't think it's something that we need to purely base our imagination on, because if we actually look at the reality of our different Antarctic research organizations today, there's a huge amount of diversity and a lot of women that are participating in Antarctic research already today. But the fact is that still the way we record, celebrate, and lift up potentially and profile diversity and more diverse voices is still lagging behind. So within the Arctic research community, there are some examples from the broader community of trying to address this and actually celebrate the existing diversity, especially in terms of gender. I've lifted out two examples here, the first one is the Wikibomb event that was led by Jan Strugnell in 2016, which was a SCAR initiative where they created 100 different profiles of female Antarctic researchers, and then did a celebratory event as part of one of the SCAR Open Science conferences. And more recently, we've had the 100 Polar Women campaign led by the Women in Polar Science Network. And you can see an example of that and a profile of a Latin American Argentine researcher on the bottom right-hand corner. I've put in the QR code if you want to see more, then hopefully you might be able to go back to that QR code and scan it. And again, I'd like to kind of bring back this question of like different kinds of identities and the fact that it's amazing to start celebrating diversity. But what we really want to start looking into within our organizations is also thinking about how we can challenge and deconstruct some of the structural and historical barriers that different people are faced with, and especially how different people's, the different parts of their identities intersect and create barriers so that we can be very inclusive in our approaches, because that will ultimately benefit everyone, be it from a gender perspective or some other parts of identity. So if we come back to the SCAR context, for the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, we are an international body that was established to facilitate international collaborations in Antarctic science. So we are a global volunteer-based organization that has an executive secretariat. As a network, we bring together huge science programs and global, truly international collaborations, not just in physical sciences, but also on the social science side. So it's a really amazing organization, kind of bringing a lot of different kinds of interdisciplinary researchers together. SCAR also acts as advisor to the Antarctic Treaty System. So this is the system that governs all the activities within the Antarctic. And as an organization, SCAR, a couple of years ago in 2020, realized that, it was time to do something very explicit in terms of actioning and addressing EDI within its organization itself and for its community. And to that end, a scoping group was established to kind of look at what existing data was available on EDI and what would be the best next steps to, as an organization, kind of bring EDI more to the forefront of everything that we're doing. And that scoping group's work led to kind of identification of different areas of work and the recommendation of forming an action group, which is kind of one of the models of working within our organizational structure in the summer of 2021. And the ultimate aim was to answer this question: what can SCAR do to create, structural and cultural change within its spheres of influence? So the EDI Action Group reports directly to the SCAR Vice President for Capacity Building and the delegates meeting, so has very direct lines, high level in the organization, which is kind of unique to other structures within the community otherwise. And as a group, we have representation from different community subgroups and geographies. This is really important to say because obviously when you're talking about a global reach of an organization, you need to think about all the different areas of research and how they can be represented. So be it our early career researchers or people who are not working necessarily so heavily on the research side, but are supporting our logistics for all the science that happens. So it's really important that we have people who have different kinds of experience and are connected with the different activities that happen within the broad umbrella of Antarctic science. And I've mentioned this also, this notion of different geographies. I would like to say that within the EDI Action Group, we're still very heavily represented from Western countries. There is some broader representation, but I think that's still depictive of how maybe some of the EDI conversations today are kind of brought and pushed forward. So it's just a reflection on our own awareness of our own kind of positionality in those terms. If you want to know a lot more about what we're doing within the SCAR EDI Action Group in detail, there's the QR code to the web pages that are housed under the SCAR website. But broadly speaking, we were tasked with looking at how we can effectively deal with different EDI issues and what practical actions might be relevant for the organization. And quite quickly, we had like a task list of things that we started pushing forward around codes of conduct and data collection, just as some examples. I think it would be excellent for the panel to also kind of reflect a little bit on what value the action, additional value kind of the action group can bring from their experiences. So this is one example of targeted EDI work that SCAR has commissioned. And this has happened in parallel to the formation of the EDI Action Group. So I believe it was in 2020 or 2021, one of our panelists later, Morgan, started a SCAR Fellowship looking at intersectional frameworks for understanding gender equality in international Antarctic research. And I personally think that increasing the credibility of what we do within our organizations is extremely essential. And the importance of social science participation, especially in driving this kind of change forward, is really key. And the kind of work like Morgan has done, really looking from a social science perspective at our organization and how different approaches could have positive impacts on what we do, is really a very fruitful perspective for us. And there's more and more examples of this coming from social sciences across the whole community. So this is something that I personally think is extremely valuable for creating change. Simultaneously, as we need these more broad intersectional approaches, we also need to remember that in some areas, it's really important to listen to specific lived experience. And there are networks like the Accessibility in Polar network that brings together researchers with disabilities and gets their voice heard and brings that voice to the table. Is really important that in certain specific areas, we're also listening to those very kind of specific perspectives, but then kind of bringing together the challenge in terms of where the intersecting identities meet, and how we can push forward change that is actually ultimately helping different people. And it would be really good to kind of discuss how we best connect with social scientists and communicate their work, because sometimes also social science papers aren't the most accessible for all audiences. So this is something where I think the EDI Action Group within the SCAR community, for example, can bring added value. So I've already talked a little bit about like the assumptions and bias, and the fact that if we're coming from different geographic locations and different cultural settings, we need to be really careful on how we understand the challenge around diversity and inclusion. And especially for an organization like SCAR that's global, it's sometimes really difficult to define the challenge, because we really need a lot of intercultural competence to understand some of the cultural differences and bring people on board at the same level. It's very easy to be extremely focused on action when you are used to working in an area where, for example, some of the challenges are extremely defined. But when you come to a global organization, it's really important that we're creating space for listening and learning, and actually figuring out what assumptions and biases we might be introducing to the work very early on. So that sort of level of self-reflection is really important. And with that in mind, in defining the challenges, we need to then think of the micro level, which is more the individual level, the meso level, which is our institutional level, and then the macro level, which is the much broader kind of societal and political level. So what are our aims, and at which level do we need to be thinking about our community, our audience, and who we're trying to influence and implement the change for? Within our organizations, there's also things that structurally might create barriers for individuals. So these are some EDI issues might be behavioral and cultural at times, but a lot of advances can be made with structural implementation in very productive ways. And for an organization, if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, which depicts all the Antarctic Treaty nations, you can see that there's a huge variety of languages. So how do we actually make sure that we are creating information and bringing people along who don't always feel comfortable with English as their day-to-day language, as it's often assumed that everyone will be able to communicate in that? And just highlighting the fact that we are a volunteer-based organization, it, of course, creates a little bit of difficulties in pushing kind of projects forward, because people need to find the time. So we need to find ways of really centering EDI and making sure that it's pervasive and not an optional kind of add-on of something to put effort in. And then, of course, you know, as we define the challenges, as we define our understanding, we need to make sure that we're actually then putting things in motion that create action and create change. I would like to just highlight how some added ways that SCAR is a very unique organization. So we have, as I already mentioned, we influence the Antarctic Treaty System. So having that sort of presence at bilateral political meetings also creates another level of influence that we have, and we should really be mindful of in terms of how we're using. And I think especially for the Antarctic Treaty System, the fact that we can leverage social science knowledge in the area of diversity and inclusion is really key, because there are certain nations where these kind of questions around diversity and inclusion definitions are not always easy to bring to the table for conversation. So having that sort of scientific level of credibility is extremely important. So using those spheres of influence, be it the Antarctic Treaty System, our own secretariat, our expert networks, that's where we need to be working together and thinking about how we can best leverage and create change. So then just moving on to my final slide, in terms of some of the insights, I think I could talk about this work for hours if I was given the time, but I'm going to start wrapping up. It's really important that when we think of very targeted pieces of work, we think about the relevance for the audience and who we're trying to create change for. So are we trying to talk about cultural clashes and more behavioral kind of expectations, setting codes of conduct for our community more in general, or are we trying to influence the composition and EDI considerations of our own secretariat, for example? So we need to be really thinking carefully about that relevance, depending on where we're targeting our action. I've said intersectional approaches many times. I really can't emphasize the importance of that. I think especially in terms of certain conversations where it's very easy to make assumptions, even just in terms of gender and thinking about gender in very binary terms still. It's important that we start kind of pushing our minds and thinking about how people's identities might be affected by different layers of their life. And then balancing this sort of dual kind of thing between taking action and actually creating space for conversation, especially in this global setting that I've been talking about. Creating that space for listening and having conversations is still extremely important. Creating practical tools for the community. You have to make EDI make sense for people, and sometimes it starts with the easiest things. It's about giving someone a code of conduct that they can start their meetings with. So thinking about what are those easy entry points for the community at large. And then not just getting too stuck with the small scale stuff, but the importance of strategic direction can't be missed either, because it really influences how you can bring people along. So if you can kind of start communicating your vision at a larger scale, it's much easier for people to see how they can contribute in different ways to creating that longer term change. And I think especially when it comes to EDI, it's important to remember that there's so many people doing so much good work. So we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. We should think about ways that we're integrating and disseminating existing knowledge already. And just being part of the webinar today and talking to the STEM community in a broader sense, I think is a really good starting point. And a stepping stone to create new connections as well. So with that, I hope that we will stay in touch. My email address is there, and I can, of course, put you in touch with different people from our SCAR EDI Action Group as well, and hopefully some of the different networks that we work with. So please, if there's anything that you think might be interesting for us, do get in touch. Or if you have any questions that you can't propose today, you can get in touch with me via email as well. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Pilvi, for sharing that with us. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, you can put those in the comments in YouTube. It's my pleasure now to then introduce our next speaker, Angus, who will be talking to us about accessibility in polar research. Angus Aldis is actually the co-founder of Access Polar, along with 5 others who are based across Europe and North America. He and the other committee members formed Access Polar to understand how polar research disqualifies researchers with disabilities from pursuing their dreams, and then implement and suggest solutions to address this. So today he'll be talking to us about polar challenges, Access Polar, and the need for disabled inclusion and representation in polar research. And so, Angus, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's really good. So I hope we can all see the screen. I'm hoping. There we go. Okay. So yes, my name is Angus Aldis, and I'm here today talking to you from my organisation Access Polar, or APR, or Accessibility in Polar Research. We have many aliases and we haven't quite figured out which one we want to use yet. But I'm here talking to you about disabled inclusion and representation in polar research. So to sum up who we are a UK and USA based organisation made up of 6 volunteers, and we all have full-time jobs. We just do this on our own back, but we all have disabilities in some format and have faced adversities because of our disabilities. But we were actually founded during the pandemic way back in May 2021. And so it's really amazing for us to be here on an international platform when just 6 months ago, we were still talking on Zoom from our bedrooms and from our offices. So thank you so much for letting us speak with you today. A bit more on who I am. As mentioned, I am a co-founder of APR, and I do have multiple disabilities, and these are learning difficulties, as an example, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dyscalculia, which I can never really spell or say, which is quite ironic. And I also have a physical disability called hypermobility, which affects my tendons and my joints. But also, just for a bit of representation, I am also LGBTQ+ in science. I identify as both aromantic and asexual, which I just really wanted to highlight because it's important for representation, particularly at the moment in the UK, because asexuals are coming under fire a bit. But I just wanted to let you know that that's how I identify. And if anyone else does, please reach out to me, because it would be nice to have a chat. And lastly, I'm a PhD student in astrobiology, which is really cool. So I look at one of Saturn's moons and what life might be inside of it. But as I said, I'm not the only committee member. There are 5 other lovely looking people here, and Dog, who is the official APR mascot. But you can go and check all these lovely people out. We all, in some format, are in either oceanography, marine biology, or space sciences. And we all absolutely really want to change the scene when it comes to disabilities. So let's get to the main meat of the presentation. I want to convey to you today what it's like to be a researcher with a disability in polar science. And there are so many articles and resources out there that sum this up quite nicely. But this particular article really has a fantastic quote in that I wanted to share with you today. And this quote is that we as researchers with disabilities are expected to work extra hard to fit into current academic culture. And so we're expecting similar hard work and effort from these institutions that can help and support and accommodate us. And I think this quote doesn't just resonate with people with disabilities, but it resonates with multiple historically excluded groups, because we are working super hard to just hit that basic level of energy. And it's a really important perspective for context as to how researchers with disabilities are being disqualified from pursuing their dreams. One of APR's first initiatives was to try and understand where our resources were best put. How is the polar field really discouraging us? And we identified 3 really key areas. The first is what are called blanket policies that are based on a 2-dimensional diagnosis of a disability. And what I mean by this is if a researcher with disabilities was applying for a bit of field work, and on their application form, they had to put their disability, more often than not, institutions and fieldwork organisers on that bit of paper will see, I don't know, diabetes and hypermobility, and they'll immediately think, okay, that's disability, completely, you're not allowed. And I know it sounds really sort of disheartening, but it is the case. A lot of people with disabilities and with specific disabilities aren't actually allowed to go to the field. But what we want to emphasize is that these policies are not only wrong, but they need to be based on a three-dimensional diagnosis. And this brings me to the second point, which is coping mechanisms. More often than not, people with disabilities have developed coping mechanisms for their entire life. Particularly with invisible disabilities, we have coping mechanisms that you likely won't be able to see. But if you have a disability that requires a visual coping mechanism, an example is insulin with diabetes, more often than not, again, these blanket policies come in and say, well, you can't do that in the field for your own safety and for the safety of others on the field trip, which is insane. So what we think needs to happen is that there needs to be a three-dimensional diagnosis. You know, the coping mechanisms need to be taken into account. The individual who has disabilities may actually feel fine and safe to go into the field, and that needs to be taken into account. But it's unfortunate that these 2D diagnoses are based on that traditional rhetoric that Pilvi touched on, you know, that very traditional polar researcher. And it's unfortunate that that is still a thing today. And lastly was digital accessibility. And this was really highlighted during the COVID pandemic. And this goes all the way from little things like not wanting to put specific colors on a slide, all the way up to people just flat out refusing to record lectures because that's not how they did it before the pandemic. But this point I want to show you, it's a lot easier for me to show you this point. So this is a particular color palette that's widely used in multiple scientific articles, as it should be. You know, it's got 4 primary colors, it's got orange, and it's really easily differentiated. But for people like myself who have learning difficulties or other folk who are colorblind, that same color palette changes when being viewed. And now you can see that color palette goes into browns and really dull colors that are actually really hard to differentiate. So that's what we see when we're looking at that palette and that color. And I think it's really important to highlight this because it not only stops us from engaging with scientific material, but it stops the person who's using that color palette from communicating their research, which is a loss for everybody. So I think that's just a really worthy point to highlight. And I've got some accessible color palettes that I can send to people that are okay to use in your posters and presentations. So I wanted to touch on some personal experiences in polar research and how the field is generally missing out because they're excluding us. You know, we have talents being disabled. And I want to talk about how my disabilities actually make me a better scientist. Before I talk about that, I want to put a disclaimer here in, and I'm not saying that I'm generalizing this disability. A lot of other people with learning difficulties might feel as though that their disability is a negative thing, and I completely understand that. For me, my learning difficulties have been both negative and positive, but I want to talk about the positive aspect of my disabilities. So first of all, just because one hypothesis can't be solved one way, it doesn't mean that it can't be solved a second way. And for me, I'm a massive visual learner, and I really, really can see things in front of me rather than reading a textbook. And this visual learning is excellent because it means that I can address a hypothesis or an experiment from a different perspective, which has really helped me in my career. Secondly, I've been diagnosed with disabilities for about 12 years now. And since I was about, I think it was 10 or 11, I got diagnosed. I've had to independently structure and organize my entire work life and my career, which has meant that I've developed really good timekeeping skills, really good independent structuring skills, and generally feel as though I'm quite on it most of the time, but it's just because I've had to be on it. And lastly, this is a point that I think that spans multiple disabilities and multiple historically excluded groups. And it's the fact that we, as people with disabilities and from historically excluded groups, have to continually justify our relevancy in STEM and why we should be there. And so I think that sort of, well, it's not really a positive, but that sort of continual justification has led to improved scientific communication skills, improved advocacy skills, and is something that I'm actually really, really pleased to have had, because it means that I know my own mind and I know sort of how to communicate better. I say that I've probably made a grammatical mistake somewhere in this presentation, I'm sure of it. But aside from that personal story, I want to finish on a positive. I think it's really important because I probably just depressed us all with saying the polar field is not good and everything. But it is, because we as researchers with disabilities are seeking out solutions and ways forward. There are so many organizations and fantastic people out there who are ready to break down barriers and who are trying to increase awareness for people with disabilities and for other historically excluded groups. And APR is doing that with these three things. Firstly, at the moment, we've got a live survey which you can access via the QR code. And this survey is collecting data on how the polar field is disqualifying researchers from pursuing their dreams. And we hope to use the data collected to create an open and free resource for fieldwork organisers and for institutions to gain a better understanding of the disability perspective, and to also help them practice inclusivity and to really show them, well, actually, we can do fieldwork, we can do science. We also run multiple workshops. Our last one was talking about how you can be a better ally for somebody with disabilities, or how your institution could supervise somebody with disabilities. And we had glowing feedback, and I'm really, really pleased that that workshop went well, because it was really important for us to convey not only the perspective, but how to be a better ally. And we've got a couple more in the works as well, so keep an eye on us. And lastly, we're really hoping to get some funding so we can do a long-term project that looks at how we can all better attract researchers with disabilities into the polar field. And this project will be a series of publications, posters, conferences, etc., sort of highlighting the key points, those barriers that we face, the ways that our disabilities are positive, the ways that you can be better allies, or the ways in which fieldwork can actually be really safe and really fun for somebody with disabilities. But I hope I haven't depressed you all too much. It really is, you have to find that medium of being sort of that advocate, but also you really just don't want to make everyone really depressed after leaving something. But I hope you all got some information out of that. And there's the QR code again. If you want to contact myself, any of the committee members, or us as an organization, please do. We'll be more than happy to chat. But thank you all so much for letting me present today. I've really, really felt as though that was a good presentation to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angus. And again, any questions into YouTube? I'm sure people will be interested in the resources you mentioned in that really great talk. So thank you again. Now, I'd like to move forward with our next speaker, Kimberly Atkins, who is a PhD student at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania. So Kimberly is working on research focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion in extreme and remote workplace environments. And so the name of her talk is Nurturing the I in Diversity. Kimberly, please have the floor.
Thank you, Gilda, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone. One moment, might be sharing the wrong screen. Forgive me.
It was the right one, Kimberly.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so as Gilda mentioned, my name is Kimberly Atkins, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Tasmania here in Australia. Before I get started, though, I would like to make some sort of brief introductory remarks, which are some thanks to the organizers for arranging this webinar and for the invitation to speak today. The opening of my presentation will begin with a bit more information about who I am, my journey to the poles, and my experience working in the polar community, followed by the main presentation, Nurturing the I in Diversity. One second. I didn't see that the screen turned over there for a minute. Sorry about that. I think it started sharing the wrong screen. Are we able to move forward now? I'm having a bit of difficulty moving forward in the slides here. I do apologize.
Kimberly, click back onto your PowerPoint slide and then it should start moving ahead. I sometimes have the same after you've like shared. It's kind of like on the Zoom command.
Okay, I will give that a try and see what is happening here. Hopefully my computer didn't time out. I think that is where the issue may come in at. My apologies. Interesting. Okay, so let's see here. I am not sure how it is sharing on your screen.
Now we see the wrong screen, Kimberly.
All right, so sorry about this. Forgive me. Let's see if it's going to pick up the right screen this time and if I can move forward.
That's the right screen?
Yes, it is the right screen, but I am not able to move forward in the screen for some reason.
And if you click just on the PowerPoint, still like with your cursor.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I see it. It did time out for a bit there. So apologize. Thank you for your patience. Yes, so as I was mentioning before I get started into going into my presentation, I would like to acknowledge and recognize the deep history and culture of the traditional owners of Nipaluna, Hobart, the Palawa and Muwinina people of this island, Lutruwita, also known as Tasmania, from which I give my presentation this evening. I acknowledge the contributions of all Aboriginals, past, present, and emerging leaders and elders for their stewardship to country and land, and for ensuring that the culture and Black ancestry of Lutruwita people is not forgotten. So on this slide here, this is a little bit about me and some affiliations and organizations that I hold membership in. I advance equity, diversity, and inclusion work with the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, also known as IARPIC Collaborations, where I'm a co-lead with several of my other Arctic colleagues working in the diversity and inclusion community practice group. I also continue EDI efforts as a network of experts at the Oregon State University, their Polar STEAM program, which stands for Polar Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics. And so this next slide gives you a bit of a journey, tells you a bit about my journey to the poles. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master's degree in international environmental policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And during my master's in my second year, I had the privilege of working with the executive director of the study of environmental Arctic change, working on Arctic science to policy interface, followed by my relocation to Germany, working at the German Arctic office, working on Arctic governance. And from there, I moved to Norway and I worked on Arctic plastic pollution with Grid Arendal, which is a member of a UNEP partner. And then also on Antarctic and Southern Ocean environmental conservation campaigns with the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. These should have showed up while I was talking, so I do apologize that things are a little bit out of order. And now I want to talk to you a bit about my journey as a Black woman and the challenges that I've had to overcome and the adversity that I've faced working in the polar community as a polar professional. And so on the previous slide, you know, whilst my journey to the poles may have appeared glamorizing, it has not been without significant adversity and challenges. The impact of being a Black woman in a predominantly all-white space has been distressing, to say the least. Arctic and Antarctic environmental protection remains a passion of mine. But I realized that I quickly became to others something to be tolerated, invisible, and or inconsequential. And at my lowest point, a strong desire to walk away and leave polar work behind was appealing, as the overwhelming doubt that something must be wrong with me took hold. And so that brought me to what looked like this door, where I experienced repeated acts of dismission, invalidation, and disrespect, which led to repeated feelings of unworthiness and a plethora of questions that often resulted in isolation, no sense of belonging, misery, and loneliness. And in one single experience, I was harassed, sexually harassed, bullied, and discriminated against, with no support from bystander colleagues or leadership. I was mistreated and not given the same respect and dignity as my white and Asian polar colleagues. I found myself incredibly unsupported. I was even told that, and I quote, "I do not belong here, that I do not fit into the culture. It is not a great personality fit." My experience with the polls indicates or was indicative that buzzwords such as personality fit and culture fit have been used inappropriately as a way to maintain entry for a specific racial demographic group of people to thrive and work in the polar community and in this space. And so then I met some people, one of whom is one of the panelists on today's webinar, and some Sami indigenous people of Finno-Scandinavia, who helped me create something new from all the broken pieces that I found before me. I realized that first and foremost, I am human above everything else, and I am a woman, and I am determined, and I'm a trailblazer, and I am here as a symbol of change, such that I would hope that I not see or hear of another story that a woman or person of color has to experience as a person working in the polar community. So I found my inner superwoman and found my way back up to get more involved in DEI work and working with groups like many of whom are present here on today's webinar, so that we can advance these conversations about EDI in the polar community. So we often talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and sometimes belonging. So today I want to talk about the I in diversity and nurturing the I in diversity. The I in diversity, for me, gives meaning to a lot of things, but I want to focus specifically on 5 specific things. That's the underrepresented individual, identity, intention, intersectionality, embracing inclusivity. This presentation is every bit about myself as it is for other historically underrepresented groups. The underrepresented individual is me. I am that person, and I am sure there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions more like me. So, who is the underrepresented individual? The underrepresented individual is someone whose identity is or has been associated with oppression. However, we must always remember, above all else, that individuals, no matter their identity or background, are human beings first and foremost. I emphasize the word human being because it is so often absent from mine in almost every conversation, whether generally, EDI, or otherwise. We are complex human beings with feelings and emotions, personality, etc., filled with loads of soft skills. And equally important is that we are complex human beings with multiple and sometimes overlapping identities that put some of us at a greater advantage or position in the world than others. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about social identity, the thing that each of us subscribe to. Social identity is dynamic, it varies, it's sociological and salient. Social identity gives meaning to who we are as individuals, communities, groups of people, etc. It is the thing at one intersection or another that we have in common. Some may even say identity is a way we connect with each other. It is all of these things and then some. It is we all at some point in time subscribe or identify with multiple social identities. And these identities have different combinations that at different times can impact our lived experience in the world. They are often sometimes determined and flagged by societal norms, which differences, which identities matter more, are more important at different times. And certain social identities feel more prominent in certain situations and contexts. So now I want to move on to talking about intention. To be intentional is to do something for a reason that usually involves a belief about one's reason for doing it that constitutes intention in action. Intention is deliberate, it is willing, it is voluntary and action-oriented and behavior-driven. It is making deliberate choices to reflect what is and isn't important to us. We must be intentional in our actions and behavior. Our intention must not only align with our words, but must embody and give life to these words through action and changed behavior. We must ask ourselves, as a polar community, are we intentionally prepared and willing to change our culture and our attitude towards being more inclusive of underrepresented individuals, to dismantling the power and dominance that comes with whiteness in polar research and science? EDI work is not for the faint-hearted. Its work is intense, hard, uncomfortable, and when done right, is also unapologetic. We have to get racially uncomfortable and be willing to examine the effects of racial engagement or lack thereof. And how can we do this? You heard Pilvi mention previously in her presentation about the term intersectionality. So what is intersectionality? The term was first coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw as a framework used to describe how race, gender, class, and other individual characteristics intersect and overlap with one another. Intersectionality also describes the way people from different backgrounds encounter the world through their lived experience. It is an interconnected web of factors or identities that carry influence, power, privilege, dominance, and or oppression, which you can see here on this privilege, oppression, domination wheel pointed out here, and how many of these identities put some at an advantage, whilst others may find themselves at a disadvantage based on their overlapping and intersectional identities. So now I want to move on to talking about embracing inclusivity and how we can do that. When we have mastered the art of being intentional and inclusive, as I mentioned previously, in our actions and behaviors, then we can embody these principles in our responsibility as a polar community to ensure recruitment, representation, and retention of historically excluded and underrepresented groups. Embracing inclusivity is us practicing our values rather than simply professing them. Inclusivity is action-oriented. It is connecting with underprivileged youth and professionals at school and or in the community. Inclusivity is outreach. It is intentional. It fosters genuineness and authenticity. It creates space for the individual to thrive and show up as oneself. And so I take each and every one of these values that I just mentioned between the individual, our social identities, my intention and our intention, and intersectionality and inclusivity into my PhD research that you heard Gilda mention earlier. So my PhD research asks, what can the workforce of extreme and remote environments teach us about diversity and inclusion? My research focuses on the understudied and underrepresented category of racial diversity in extreme and remote workplace environments, using Antarctica and underground mining as case studies to gain lessons and provide recommendations for recruitment and retention practices across extreme remotely located industries. And right now, what we find, or what I find, is that there is a disconnect between industry and members, underrepresented groups of people. Traditional recruitment and leadership promotion practices have often focused on selective categorization and single dimensions of diversity and identity, such as gender and/or affiliation with the LGBTQIA+ community as representation, which overlooks individuals from racial and ethnic backgrounds who fit multiple social categories of identification. So I am interested in the perspectives from industry representatives and underrepresented groups. What do they think about Antarctica and as a workplace, and why? What steps have industry taken to recruit people from historically underrepresented groups? How is the extreme and remote environment represented in recruitment imagery? Can the underprivileged see themselves in extreme and remote place environments? And why is industry choosing to exclude a vast majority of skills and expertise? So how we recruit based on diversity-specific categories gives preference to some over others. Antarctica as a workplace and as an industry is a shining example of this. The ice ceiling has no doubt shattered for women at the polls, as Pilvi mentioned in her presentation. However, the ice ceiling has broken for some women and not for others. Whilst it is certainly progress, in my opinion, it does not go far enough on the spectrum of inclusivity. What do I mean by that? I mean that white women have largely benefited from equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives more than any other racial or ethnic group of people. Gender diversity is and has largely been representative of white women, which in itself fails to embrace the meaning of diversity and inclusion at its core. There should be no reason why we selectively focus on and choose some identity groups over others. And so by using the framework of intersectionality to allow for the intersect identities of different groups of people in the world would make for a more comprehensive and nuanced way to recognize these gaps, not only in research, but in recruitment and retention practices, as well as when we assess candidates for work in Antarctica and elsewhere. So how do we nurture the I in diversity? The image before you on the screen is reflective. Its bottom half is reflected in the top portion. It is exactly the same image, just seen from a different angle. We must do exactly the same. We must create a new image, a reflective image of ourselves as a polar community, committed to underrepresented individuals and individuals with overlapping identities. A community committed to the practice of intentional action, intersectionality, and inclusivity in its truest form. This creates a polar community that is not only reflective of ourselves and the values of equity, diversity, and inclusion we strive to uphold, but one that goes beyond lip service and gives true meaning to our values. And with that, I'd like to end by saying thank you for this opportunity to be heard. here in this webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly, for that powerful presentation and for that list of links at the end as well. Again, any questions for Kimberly, please feel free to throw those into the YouTube comment section, and we'll get to those in the panel discussion, which is coming soon. But before that, we have our last speaker for today, who is Anne Treasure. Anne Treasure is the manager of the Data Products and Society node of the newly established South African Polar Research Infrastructure. She's also a member of the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Group in SCAR, and also has been working on the Code of Conduct Action Group. And her talk today is on gender equality and beyond in the polar sciences from a South African perspective. So it's my pleasure to introduce Anne today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to double check that my slides are working, if you can see them.
Yes, we can see them and hear you.
Great, okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for that introduction. And yeah, good morning or afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today on gender equality and beyond in the polar sciences, a South African perspective. My name is Anne Treasure, as the chair has said, the coordinating manager for the Data Products and Society node of the South African Polar Research Infrastructure. So today, just for some brief background, I'm going to provide some information on South Africa's polar history with a focus on diversity and inclusivity, and particularly focusing on gender and race. Given time constraints and that I don't have statistics on diversity for our whole polar research environment, I'll provide information on our overwintering teams as an
One moment, I think we have some technical difficulties with Anne. We're just going to sort that out on our end. Apologies, we will be with you shortly. Anne is currently trying to sign back in. We'll give her 1 second to try to reconnect again. Apologies for the delay. Thank you. So apologies for the delay. While we wait for Anne to reconnect, we'll actually take a moment to take some questions for the speakers that have already spoken. And so I wanted to we had some questions already. Well, I think the question about the access and polar research, whether or not there was a web page, I believe that was already answered, right, Angus? Okay, great. Thank you. You're too efficient. And Okay, after that, for Kim, in your opinion, is there any branch in which you think people of color are preferred? I know this is a very general question. And by branch, I wonder perhaps if the person who put the question forward could clarify if that was between maybe like the mining community or Antarctica, but I don't know, perhaps if you want to see if elaborate on that, Kimberly.
Thank you, Gilda, for the question and from the chat. Actually, my question was going to be if there could be some clarification on what is meant by branch. I'm not sure that I understand the question very well enough to respond at this time.
It could mean like sector. I don't know. Yeah, that's how I would read it. Maybe like sector, broadly speaking.
Okay. So branch of, I guess, STEAM or branch of STEM. Okay, so sorry, Gilda, would you mind repeating the question just once more?
No worries. The question was essentially is there a certain branch, sector, part of STEAM in which people of color are having more success or they're doing better to welcome and include these groups? Yeah, so it's quite general, but perhaps if you could sort of contrast between these.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Yeah, definitely. And thank you for the question from online. I think we can look at the space industry, for example, as a great way of, the efforts and initiatives that they have taken, how far they have come in terms of, having the first African-American man or the first Black woman on the moon. And I mean, even for example, I believe it was last year in 2022, they had the first Native American woman, as part of the International Space Station who made it into space, which was, certainly extremely uncommon in the history of the United States, for that matter. But I mean, there are some other industries that I'm aware of, like some contractors, for example, Lockheed Martin, who have been, championing a lot and doing very well in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for those who are not familiar with Lockheed Martin, they are a contractor usually for military and defense. And they have been, excelling very well in this area. And I'm sure that there are certainly many of others who are doing equally as well, in terms of moving and progressing forward in terms of EDI. And that's actually something else that I intend to look at as well, a bit more in depth in my research and what lessons we can learn from, say Lockheed Martin or maybe the South African National Antarctic Program, for example, in terms of, representation and what efforts that they're doing in terms of recruiting people from underrepresented backgrounds. But as we can see right now, since the geographic context of my research is based in Australia, that is not the case necessarily. There is the case where you may see quite a few Aboriginal people working, for example, in the mining sector. And that's something else that I will be looking at. But I mean, that's not particularly the case for polar research and science, here in Australia. And so I'm eager to find out, why that is and why that isn't. I'm sure that there are a lot of reasons, but there is also a social, I guess, organization, if you will, and a scientific organization that's called Black in Marine Science. It is based, it was founded and based by a woman named Tiara Moore in the United States. And it is a space predominantly filled with Black marine scientists. Sadly, we don't have such a thing that really exists in the polar community. There is no Black and polar science. The membership would probably be extremely small because the reality is there's just not really a lot of, Black people or people who identify as being Black, or, the racial demographic is not certainly as great as it could be in the polar community as it is in others. So there are some out there that are, doing that and are welcoming people a bit more and, having a bit more of an inclusive space. It's a bit harder and difficult on the polar side. And part of my role as a PhD Antarctic social scientist and a polar professional working alongside all of my colleagues here is to figure out how can we best speak to these communities and get them interested and involved in polar research and science. So polar policy or any area of polar work for that matter.
Thank you for that, Kimberly. And I might do a quick follow-up with respect to thinking about the fact that you're focusing on the mining communities as well as Antarctica. In the underground mining, are you looking at this on an international scale, first of all, or is there an Australian focus?
It's an Australian focus. Of course, in some of my lit review, it will start off a bit in general terms of looking at underground mining as a global, sort of enterprise. I mean, we know for sure that, looking at Canada and, for example, maybe say in some African countries that there may be, people of color or indigenous people, Black people, et cetera, who work in these areas. But then that also comes with a lot of other challenges as well, perhaps that they may not be in leadership roles and they may be in some other very different positions. But specifically for my research, I will be looking at this from an Australian context, and there may be some comparative language looking at other geographic locations, for example, and how those areas may be doing a bit better in terms of leadership or, in those industries. But just to be clear, in case if I didn't clearly state this in my presentation, my research focuses specifically on the racial inclusivity in these spaces. And so that's the category that I would like to focus on primarily, since it is an underrepresented and an understudied category when it comes to diversity, in my opinion, across many different sectors, but for sure in extreme and remote environments.
Thank you, Kimberly, for clarifying that. And I think we're going to be really interested to see the research that comes out, especially for folks in the Antarctic realm. I'd be really interested to see what those comparisons are and maybe what we could learn from what's happening in these other types of remote environments. So unfortunately, Anne has not yet managed to jump on the call. So what we're going to do for the moment is go right into our panel. And if Anne comes back, we can bring in her talk. So for the moment, I'd like to invite all of our speakers who presented today. So we have Pilvi, Angus, and Kimberly so far on the call, and as well, 3 additional panelists who I will allow them to introduce themselves, starting perhaps with Adriana. Oh, I don't think we hear you, Adriana. Maybe try without the headphones. Maybe there's a problem. Now it's good. Sorry about that.
Okay. So sorry. I'm Adriana Gulizano. I'm Chief Officer of the EDI Action Group of SCAR. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm very pleased to be here within the panel to answer your questions about the EDI group and what our goals are.
Thank you, Adriana. And now I'd like to welcome Morgan to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Morgan Sieg. I am a science policy consultant and finishing up a SCAR Fellowship working on intersectional gender equality and inequality issues in Antarctic research. Did my PhD research also focused on gender issues in the field. With apologies, there's a 3-year-old running around behind me, so I hope that won't be too disruptive, but very happy to be here.
Thank you, Morgan. And last but not least, Renuka, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Gilda. So I'm Renuka Bade, and I work at the intersection of science and policy in the polar regions. I've been a passionate advocate for diversity, and I've been one of the co-founders of the organization that's been mentioned a few times in the talks called Women in Polar Science. And like Morgan, I also serve on the leadership steering committee of the SCAR EDI Action Group. Thanks for that.
Thank you for the introductions, everyone. And so now that we have our panel assembled, I might go to some general questions that I would be happy to have input from all of you that would be interested. So first we have, if you don't mind, a general question, and we don't, speakers, what is your key message to national polar programs, or the sort of most effective first step regarding their work on access and EDI? I'm not sure, maybe if you want to raise your hand just so I can know who wants to talk first, and we can do like so. Please go ahead, Adriana.
Okay, so I think all the national programs have to have protocols and codes of conduct. Our EDI group is working on that matter. So as a starting point is for the field work is something that they should have had. So I think that's my first key point for consideration.
Thank you, Adriana. Pilvi.
Yeah, I would speak from the UK perspective and just say that for us, it was extremely helpful when we managed to get some funding externally through the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which really unlocked a lot of progress for us and brought in someone who was a specialist in this area. There are a lot of people who have lived experience within our organizations and can bring a lot of experiences forward, but it shouldn't be on their shoulders to drive that work. However, if you can bring people who are knowledgeable, who can support others and bring their perspective and voices forward, then that is a really positive way forward. So you're including those who have experiences, you're listening to them, but you're not expecting them to do the work. So I would say that's something that's certainly been very positive from our perspective and has then led to a lot of good developments, like for our revisions of our code of conduct and things like that.
Thank you, Pilvi. Angus, would you like to contribute?
Thank you. Yeah, I think from a disability perspective, the most important thing polar programs have done from our standpoint is I think they just need to listen to us. You know, we are an expert in our own disabilities. We've managed them for however many years. So if we feel as though we are comfortable going to the field, we are comfortable going to the field. I think a lot of polar programs have unfortunately said that you can't go into the field with a disability because it makes other people on the boat anxious. So certainly if we say we're comfortable, we can do it. It's just, as I say, 3D dimensional diagnosis. That's the key point of that. But yeah.
Thank you, Angus. Morgan.
Yeah, I think that as this panel has and will continue demonstrating, a lot of this work is being really driven at the grassroots level by advocates and researchers, people like those on this call. And that is essential. As Pilvi mentioned, we need to include people with lived experience at the center of the table in defining what the table looks like. But I also would have a message for institutional leaders, which is to say that the role of national Antarctic programs and other national, even local, as well as global, like SCAR organizations, can't really be overstated because of the roles that they play both in setting policies that have ripple effects throughout the community and in establishing norms to mainstream the idea, not just of women's equality, gender equality, of, as Kimberly made so clear, intersectional equity throughout these fields. And so I would say a really crucial first, or hopefully next step for national Antarctic programs is to ensure that those at the top are leading with that intersectional mindset that Kimberly's presentation made so clear.
Thank you, Morgan. Renuka.
Yeah, this is probably going to repeat a couple of the points brought up by Pilvi and Morgan, but because they're so important, I might just go ahead and do that. Sustained funding and leadership from organizations at the national and international level is extremely important. Organizations like SCGES play a good role in that perspective to bring up this issue with the unions and the scientific agencies that are members of SCGES. We also have organizations like SCAR that are really pushing the boundaries quite hard by providing that space for discussion and for normalizing this discussion, that we should be having issues regarding EDI discussed openly and honestly, and we should try and make sure that the polar community becomes as inclusive as possible. So that was basically my message, but and it was repeated message from what Pilvi and Morgan said, but I believe it needs to be repeated. So there we go.
Thank you, Renuka, and I don't think it's a message we can repeat enough. So thank you for that. And finally, Kimberly.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I echo everything that all the speakers have said before me in terms of a key message. And I guess just adding on to everything else that, everyone else has said without repeating anything, maybe just said a bit differently. I'd like to add that I'd like to see, more organizations and more of us as scientists and so on involved in underrepresented communities and reaching out in those spaces in the same way that we target other communities and people who happen to perhaps maybe of more privileged backgrounds. I think the introduction of the polar community and polar research and science at a very, very young age is very impressionable. Is something that, we could certainly do more of. I recognize that funding a lot of times is an issue to maybe do some of the larger, grander things. But something as simple as even, mentorship, going into these spaces, showing who we are, starting that conversation, having that engagement at that level and sort of continuing and building that up through, the different youth and age groups as they come up. They're obviously starting and coming from a very sort of different track or pipeline, if you will, coming into this space. And so that's a key message that I think I would like to leave with everyone and that I'd like to see perhaps us maybe doing a little bit more of.
Well put. Thank you very much, Kimberly, for that last comment on the answers to that first question. We're actually going to take a pivot now. We luckily got Anne back on the line. So we're going to pause the panel for the moment. So if panelists, you don't mind going back into incognito mode, thank you so much for jumping on early. I'd like to give the floor back to Anne to continue her presentation on gender equality and beyond in the polar science, a South African perspective. Here you go, Anne.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what happened. My Zoom crashed, and I honestly don't know at what point it did crash. So let me try again and hope that it does not crash this time. Okay. So I just want to double check. I don't want to have to repeat myself, or should I just do the whole thing again?
We heard you until you said about the wintering data from wintering teams, I think.
So had I gone through all of these?
No, not at all. The second slide you crashed.
Oh, wow. So really early on. Okay, so I'll do it all again. Okay, great. I'm really sorry about that. I really don't know what happened. Okay, so let me start again. Yes, so thank you very much. And I really apologize for that. And thank you again for the invitation to speak today on gender equality and beyond in the polar sciences, a South African perspective. So just briefly again, I'm going to provide some background, some information on South Africa's polar history with a focus on diversity and inclusivity, particularly focusing on gender and race. And yeah, so as I've said, given time constraints, I'm not going to talk about diversity for our whole polar research environment. I'll just provide information on our overwintering teams as a case study. And then a look at history and where we are now regarding diversity and the challenges we face, as well as some solutions to these challenges. So just briefly for some background, in the Antarctic and subantarctic region, South Africa has 3 remote research stations, one on Gough Island, one on Marion, and our base on Antarctica called Sanai 4. And these stations are resupplied once a year each. And during these resupply expeditions, the bases are full with about 100 personnel. And when the ship leaves after the takeovers, the overwintering teams stay at the stations for a year until the vessel returns for the next year's resupply. And these overwintering teams range from about 8 to 20 people, depending on the station. This is our polar research and supply vessel, the SA Gullis 2. This vessel is used predominantly for the resupply expeditions to our research stations, during which time oceanographic research transects are also undertaken. And the vessel goes out for about 2 dedicated oceanographic voyages a year, depending on funding. The vessel is also commissioned occasionally, one of the most well-known and recent ones being the successful expedition to search for Shackleton's Endurance. So if we take a quick look at South Africa's polar history, and a special acknowledgement to Ria Olivier and the Antarctic Legacy of South Africa project for many of these slides and images, which are available on the ELSA archive. And I do encourage you to go and look at this archive. It's an amazing resource of South Africa's legacy in the Antarctic. So South Africa is the only African country with an Antarctic presence and program, and is one of the gateway countries to Antarctica, with Cape Town being a gateway city. And certainly in the past, for example, what is known as the heroic age, already mentioned by Pilvi earlier, many Antarctic explorers used Cape Town as a stopping point and a place to refresh their supplies before continuing on their journeys south. The first South African to the South Pole was Hannes Lachranci, who represented South Africa on the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And then in 1959, the first South African team went to Antarctica on a Norwegian vessel. And in December 1959, South Africa was one of the first signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. And then it was in 1960 that the first South African team overwintered on Antarctica in a Norwegian base. And these are some lovely images available on the ELSA archive. And since then, we've had 4 bases built, each one being built as the older one before it was decommissioned. And we now have Sanai 4, which was inaugurated in 1997. And as mentioned, I don't have time or the full statistics to cover all equality, diversity, and inclusivity issues involved for all of the various areas involved in our polar research. So I'm going to use overwintering teams as a case study. So if we look at Sanai, particularly focusing on race and gender, the first woman to overwinter was in 1997. So this was a whole 37 years since the first team overwintered. Women were not allowed to overwinter in the early days. And then in 1998, we had the first non-white overwinterer. And the first non-white woman to overwinter was only in 2006. So a whole 46 years since the first overwintering team. If we have a quick look at then and now, from the early days to the present day, on the left, we have the 1961 overwintering team at Sanai, and on the right, the 2022 Sanai team. In the past, it was very much a white male-dominated environment, as would have been apparent in all the historical photos that I've shown about our history up to now as well. We have come a long way, but for gender, there is still a skewed ratio towards males. And this is possibly, though, also to do with the jobs that overwintering team members hold at Sanai, which are predominantly engineering and mechanics type roles. And these are still very much male-dominated fields. So if we move to Marion Island, this was annexed by South Africa in 1947. It's one of 2 islands in the Prince Edward Island archipelago. The other island, called Prince Edward, was annexed in 1948. And the first science expedition to Marion was in 1947. The first overwintering team to Marion was in 1948. And again, some lovely old images from the ELSA archive. And we now have teams there year-round conducting scientific research. We've had a new base built, and as well as collecting weather data for South Africa's Weather Service. If we look a bit at the diversity since the early days, the first woman overwinterer was in 1986, and the first non-white overwintering team member was in 1989. And then it was only in 2003 that we had the first non-white woman to overwinter. So a whole 55 years since the first overwintering team. And she was, in fact, the first non-white woman to overwinter at our Antarctic base, Sanai, as well, 3 years later. A little then and now, on the left is the 1950 overwintering team. Again, very much a white male environment. On the right, as you can see, this is our 2021-2022 team. We have much more diverse teams these days. Lastly, if we have a quick look at Gough Island is British territory. South Africa leases part of this for a research station. It's one of our main meteorological or weather stations for South Africa. And we have overwintering teams there conducting scientific research as well year-round. There was a scientific survey expedition in 1955, and the overwintering team on Gough was in 1956. Sorry, the first overwintering team was in 1956. So a little then and now. The Gough team on the left, this is our first overwintering team in 1956. We have much smaller teams on Gough than we do at our other stations. And over time, the diversity and inclusivity of the teams has definitely improved. So the overall challenges to be addressed to ensure improved equality, diversity, and inclusivity are along the lines of transformation, harassment and discrimination, and decolonization. And transformation has to do with redressing the historical imbalances that were created by, for example, the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. And transformation is also about providing equal opportunities. And we also need to address issues such as patriarchy and other barriers to gender equality. We also need to focus on harassment and discrimination issues. I haven't covered specifics of this today, given time constraints, but as in many other polar programs, harassment and discrimination do occur, highlighted by Kimberly earlier with her experiences, and this needs to be researched and addressed, looking at factors such as ethnic origin, religion, citizenship, language, age, political or other opinion, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability, which Angus has described so well in his presentation earlier. Decolonization, these conversations are underway in South Africa. We need to have these conversations about what this means in our polar research, at our stations, in our Antarctic program, also within our education and academic spaces and curricula, and other areas we have yet to identify and talk about. So some solutions, particularly surrounding transformation. If we talk about transformation within, for example, our overwintering teams, our logistics personnel, technicians, researchers, students, etc., transformation is a strong focus of South Africa, as can be seen in the positive changes in our overwintering teams, for example. And relevant to South African polar research, our departments of science, our forestry, fisheries and the environment, and of science and innovation are already working to ensure transformation and adhering to government policies and guidelines in this respect. Our National Research Foundation, which is the funding body of our Department of Science and Innovation, they fund our scientific research, and they have requested a transformation study. This is from an institute called CREST, which is the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology. And this is a scientometric study in the marine, Southern Ocean and Antarctic research categories to serve as a baseline to understand where we are with respect to transformation in these research categories. And this information will hopefully inform possible interventions to increase representation, and ultimately the study should inform the NRF if designated groups are underrepresented and what the NRF should do to unblock this pipeline. We also have the newly established South African Polar Research Infrastructure, who I work for, and this was launched in 2021 under our Department of Science and Innovation, and it has very specific objectives, which I won't go through in detail. But pertinent to this discussion today is the objective to transform the access to and perception of the South African polar regions for all, and to facilitate easier access to infrastructure for all. So for SAPRI, transformation is a key pillar, and equality, inclusivity, and diversity are fundamental to SAPRI's objectives and vision. And representation is considered in everything that we do. So even, for example, in our corporate identity development, which we are busy with, so a logo, a website, a promotional video, for example, we are ensuring to highlight that not one specific group is highlighted, and we need to ensure representation of all. We are addressing EDI issues such as harassment. This involves the need to confront the challenges and to have conversations about the challenges, and recognizing the need to do research about the occurrence of harassment and the extent to which it occurs, to then be able to deal with it. And for this, we are developing a code of conduct. This is already in place for some voyages. And in this vein, I joined the SCAR EDI committee and the Code of Conduct Action Group to be able to join in the larger conversations about these issues, and to try and contribute to the community, and also to learn from the wider discussions and be able to take the SCAR Code of Conduct and adapt it to South African circumstances. However, we do recognize that implementing a code of conduct is a very tricky thing, as our polar research environment involves many stakeholders, institutes, government departments, organizations, etc. And the code of conduct is only really useful if there is a reporting procedure and disciplinary measures if necessary. And for this, we need buy-in from all stakeholders to make it effective. We're also planning on designing and establishing a mentorship program within the next 2 years, and this will help to support the promotion of transformation and EDI within South African polar research by mentoring students. And we also have comprehensive engagement, education, and outreach programs And these create awareness in polar research while addressing transformation and inclusivity. And these are run at schools, tertiary education facilities, and for the public. We have programs and strategies in engagement, education, and outreach with a focus on, or with an element of polar research, that are run by the Antarctic Legacy of South Africa project, which I've mentioned, and our host institute for SAPRI, the South African Environmental Observation Network, or SAON, as well as our Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and our National Research Foundation of the Department of Science and Innovation that funds research. They include a focus on engagement and outreach specifically for polar work, and especially focusing on transformation. And for SAPRI, we are busy finalizing our engagement strategy together with ELSA and with SAON. So in conclusion, in South Africa, we do have challenges with equality, diversity, and inclusivity in polar research. And while we do have some way to go, we are making good progress in addressing these challenges, with plans going forward to continue confronting the challenges with the aim to resolve the issues. It's important to understand your society and community and the challenges they face and why, and then to not be afraid to confront the challenges and to recognize and acknowledge them and talk about them. And hand in hand with this is to look at and learn from history, and then to have the necessary conversations, even if these conversations are difficult or uncomfortable. And this is important to be able to address the challenges and find solutions to them. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you again to the Antarctic Legacy of South Africa project for historical images and archive materials. I have a very short reference list if anyone is interested. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
I tried to whiz through that because I'm really aware that we've lost quite a bit of time.
Absolutely no worries. It wasn't too fast. Thank you very, very much. I'm just so glad we got to actually get you back online and to share the South African perspective on all of these issues. Thank you again. I would like at this time to now bring back the rest of our speakers from today, as well as our panelists. So once again, we have Pilvi, Angus, Kimberly, and Anne, who are our speakers, and we have Adriana, Renuka, and Morgan as our additional panelists. So we have one additional question that had come in from YouTube. Once again, Griffith, thank you for all of your questions. And I will pose this to the group. Once again, if you could raise your hand, and I can call on all those who would like to contribute. So his question is, how does remote and virtual access factor into improving diversity and inclusion in polar research? He continues, is there a fundamental difference between on-the-ground field work versus remote and virtual participation? Is this a tool for improvement or a separate arena with respect to remote and virtual engagement? Please, Adriana, you can begin.
Thank you. Okay, so I think the digital or the, let's say, virtual participation in the campaigns can provide some coping solutions for different kinds of research. I mean, even with drones, you can be in the other side of the world, or you can be doing astronomy and pointing out a different star from another continent and make observations. So I think this is broadened the Antarctic research in a way. And of course, the access to these resources, to these online resources, has to be really among other researchers, and it wouldn't have to be restricted to some kind of, or some particular ethnicity or gender or whatever. I mean, of course, we all know that in STEM, there are few participation of women, and there, of course, more participation of male colleagues. But I think these kind of resources make more accessible for researchers from all over the world to Antarctica. I think that's a very important point. Well, to use these kind of resources in polar research.
Thank you, Adriana. Sylvie.
Yeah, I think I would just like to raise a point that often comes up with these sorts of conversations where it's like a hybrid and remote options should definitely be something that's part of our future. If we talk about accessibility, for example, for disabled colleagues, it shouldn't be the only option to try and, you know, give them some sort of access, like Angus has amazingly presented in his talk, for example. You know, it's having that 3D vision and not just saying, okay, say we put you in that box of being disabled, but we'll give you this remote participation option. It's about like understanding how you can really like create more opportunities for everyone and then kind of bring new ways of working for everyone. And in many occasions, I think there's a lot of intersections also with the net zero agenda, for example. I mean, we're having to think about decarbonization in our operations. And even just for that agenda, there's going to be a lot of things that we want to kind of like marry up with accessibility online and remote ways of doing things. Just really quickly to say that in Antarctica you still have quite a lot of problems with connectivity. So there are some limitations still that will need technological advances in order to really push things forward. But I think things in that arena move really much quicker than we can even anticipate.
Thank you, Pilvi. Renuka.
Yeah, thanks, Pilvi. I think I really want to flag up the amazing work being done by an EU-funded project called Interact. And the way they have done this is, and I also wanted to just define for people who are not aware of the terms, the work that comes under remote and the work that comes under virtual access. So for virtual access is something that you would access online, you know, like the digital twins projects and stuff like that. With respect to remote access, it's basically someone who is already present on station who does your work for you. So that means that you don't have to travel as a researcher to the station just to pick up a sample. You train the people who are there and they will pick up your samples for you. And Interact really has been the absolute project right in front there who has introduced these ways of working, and they have really found that these work really, really well to increase accessibility. And also, you know, disability isn't just one reason why people may not be able to go to the field. Having a family, for example, or whatever reason anyone has, there's always more reasons to consider than just one aspect. So I think in that sense, I agree with Pilvi fully that considering more options than just one should always be the start for anything that we plan. Thanks.
Thank you, Renuka. Angus.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with everything that's been said. I think it's really interesting because there are certain benefits from using different like tools for remote fieldwork, like VR and remote access. But I think there's definitely an educational equality aspect to be considered. You know, if this remote fieldwork stuff is being used as a substitute for inaccessible field trips or for field trips that people can't go on because they have other commitments or disabilities, it can be a huge problem. But if it's being used for everybody, you know, both disabilities, able-bodied, etc., it can be a really fantastic tool for everyone to be like immersed in, and you can really reap the benefits from. But I think definitely remote fieldwork, if you're doing it as somebody with disabilities, it can be quite isolating, quite alienating, because you're not part of that scientific community. So yeah, definitely fantastic points made. But yeah, definitely it can be used, but make sure everyone uses it, I think.
Thank you, Angus. Morgan.
I'll be quite brief to build on a lot of what's been said, especially by Angus just now, which is to say that I think in institutional EDI work, there's really a desire to find solutions, implement them so that we can move on. And that is not the reality of how change happens. And so especially for those who are leading in this work, to lead with that mindset we've been talking about understanding structures and inequity as opposed to just diversity, requires not only the courage to enact change, but also the humility and openness to hear that these are not always straightforward solutions. And so there is increasing research as well as community discourse about the fact that virtual participation in the field or in conferences or in fellowships and so on is hugely beneficial, especially to those who might have certain disabilities or caregiving responsibilities. But as Angus said, it also comes with drawbacks. And one that I'm not sure has really been highlighted yet is the loss of networking opportunities. And so that's just to say, to not see these as either or as one comprehensive one-size-fits-all solution, but rather to make sure that those who come from historically excluded backgrounds are at the table so that we can have this as an ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Morgan. Adriana.
Yes, I agree with Morgan and with everything that has been said. I mean, providing more options for everybody. I mean, not only disabled people, but for everybody to be able to do research in Antarctica. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that, like Renuka had pointed out, for not being in person there. And you can get people, get your samples and analyze it in another period of time. So you can have more.
Oh, your sound just cut out, Adriana.
Sorry. So you
now
have flexibility to make your research. So that's the flexibility. It makes you to have more options for everybody. I'm not just saying just for a targeting group. I want to make that clear, because we should explore all the technological possibilities. Of course, in scientific meetings and stuff, the face-to-face interaction is very important. But even though we all know that there has its drawbacks, providing the opportunity for people to be present at the conference, even in a remote way, that provide flexibility for people to attend anyway. So I'm not saying that that would be the only way to manage things. I think we should explore all the possibilities and have that possibility also for people. I encourage people also to attend in person and stuff, not only for carbon dioxide considerations, but also for having the opportunity to interact with people and not feeling isolated, as Angus or Kimberly have pointed out also. So I think that's important to have flexibility to provide for all the researchers, not just an ethnicity or a particular group, for everyone.
Thank you, Adriana. And I'll give the last word on this question to Renuka.
Thanks very much, Gilda. I think I just wanted to also end the responses on this note to underline the importance of having a sustained dialogue and keep having this dialogue, like Morgan was saying. Our understanding of diversity around 10 years ago, when we started speaking about this, started with gender. Then we moved on, our understanding deepened a little bit. We moved on to other underrepresented groups. And I'm talking about within the polar regions primarily. We then moved on to underrepresented minorities, whether they be based on, sexual identity or where they come from, geographical identity, and then moved on to several other identities. And recently we've started talking about intersectionality between those identities. So our understanding of what diversity should be has also moved quite considerably in the last 10 years. And that's only because we've had this sustained dialogue. So I think you cannot underscore enough the importance of keep talking about things, because we will change. Our understanding will still move on to get this to this truly inclusive place in polar research. We will have to keep talking about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Renuka. That was I think, a very appropriate last word on that point, that the job doesn't ever end, really. It just gets more interesting. I will move on to our next question, noting that we have about 5 minutes left. So how do we ensure that rules or codes of conduct actually result in cultural change, especially on ships and stations, which are far away from EDI officers or human resources departments? Anne, please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, implementing a code of conduct is very tricky. So yeah, it's something that we do recognize. For example, we have a lot of key partners and stakeholders and organizations and institutes involved in our polar research. And to implement a code of conduct, it's only really useful and effective if you have a disciplinary measure and kind of reporting procedure in place. But because everyone works for different places, that's only effective actually if all of the stakeholders and key partners buy into the code of conduct. So it's a very complex, very tricky thing to try and design and implement. So it can only really be done together with all of the other stakeholders if it is going to sort of result in cultural change.
Thank you, Anne. Morgan. Sorry, Pilvi. Apologies.
That's okay. Thanks. Yeah, I think I've lost the train of thought, but I'm sure that it'll come back. Sorry. Like policy does play a huge role in this in terms of actually following through. And I think that we're seeing some step changes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more from the UK perspective in terms of how the conversation is evolving into the sphere of health and safety and the understanding of health and safety beyond just the notion of physical safety. I think physical safety is something that's taken so seriously. I don't think there's a single national program that wouldn't take physical safety of all the individuals doing field work extremely seriously. And starting to understand mental well-being and social safety under that same umbrella and giving it the same level of importance is something where we really need to be moving towards. And I think a lot of work still needs to be done in that area. So just in terms of like key next steps, I mean, even just starting that conversation, I think for us as an organization, it's taken over a few years to get to the point where we actually have that on paper. But then when things start moving in that direction, I think that there's a lot of potential. So I am hopeful personally that that's the start of creating change in that specific like area of like implementation.
Thank you, Pilvi. Adriana. Oh,
yes. Oh, okay. So some of the this is a challenge, of course, and I would talk about more of what is going on in the Argentinian Antarctic program. There's a law that was passed, there's the Micaela law, that instates capacitation for everyone in the government position and everyone working for the state, actually, on EDI issues. And within the Antarctic program, before the campaign, everybody that would be involved, even the logistic part, I mean, usually military people is appointed for the logistic part, has to have this kind of capacitation before deploying. And of course, that's a starting point. But providing a code of conduct with protocols to try to prevent this kind of situations it's important. And of course, things like Renuka said will be evolving, and there's from different starting points to move on to have more effective measures, so everybody would be feeling not only physically safe, but also socially and mentally contained in the field and in the research. So it's a joint effort between the different institutions working on the campaign, because there are people from different universities, from different areas, with different tasks in the field. So having a capacitation before the deployment for everybody, I think that's a very good starting point, but it's not enough, of course. We have to move on and work more on that, but it's a starting point. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. And I will give our last word to Kimberly.
Thank you, Gilda, and I'll try to be brief, noting the time. Just reflecting back on the question on cultural change, I think, first of all, it depends on what type of cultural change we're talking about. I will preface my response by saying that, based on recent developments and information that has come out of the NASH report and other reports regarding unsafety, being unsafe on the ice and so on, particularly for women, is something that certainly needs to be addressed first and foremost. I would never advocate for anyone to be put in a place or in a position where, we would have people being unsafe. That's number one. But I think, I think also in terms of the cultural change, I mean, having different groups of people from different, racial backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds certainly can contribute to a cultural change in the way in which we work together, we understand one another, we learn from one another. I do not think, of course, though, that having that type of racial cultural change in this space can address our concerns about any sexual harassment and things of that nature. That is something that certainly needs to be addressed from definitely from the top. All of this starts with leadership and management and the responsibility that falls on the shoulders of these people to make sure that we keep our expeditioners and anyone on the ice, and for that matter on land, working in Antarctic research and science and/or policy, to be safe first and foremost, and that there has to be a level of accountability. These are things that we need to look at, and people need to have very hard, maybe even, if you will, difficult discussions and conversations around it. Just really needs to be full stop that this is a behavior that will not be tolerated, and and if these things continue, then again, full stop. We just have to draw the line there. But of course, I think just going back to inclusivity and and building on diversity, when you have different people from different life experience, lived experience, cultural backgrounds and experiences, and all of these other things, I think can foster the cultural change that I think many of us have been talking about here on this call, which of course is something that, it's fluid. It's something that, we bend and we move with, we adapt with, it's flexible, and we learn from one another in this way. If anything, it can only increase our knowledge about each other as human beings and how we can create a culture that is both inclusive and representative of all people of different backgrounds. So that'll just be my bit and end on that comment on that question. And thanks for that question.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And I think it indeed underlines our overarching message in many ways, which is that diversity creates the best science for the benefit of all of us. And our job is to work to provide stable funding, creating concrete change, organizational leadership, organizational implementation of that to achieve those goals. So I want to thank first and foremost our speakers today, our panelists for joining, all of our attendees from around the world who are up early, up late to participate. We really appreciate you coming. Any questions that we didn't get to, our speakers and panelists will try to respond in the comments later in YouTube. And last but not least, I would like to thank SCGES for the webinar series and all of the participants once again. Thank you so much. And we hope to be seeing all of you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.